Hello and welcome to our lesson on empirical formulae. Empirical formulae are like ratios but with chemicals. So I'd like to pause for a second and look at ratios and what you know about them in the context of this banana bread recipe. Pause the video and have a go at the blue boxes before we go any further. Okay, let's look at the ratio of bananas to eggs. I have 3 bananas and I have 2 eggs. So my ratio is 3 to 2. I cannot simplify that any further, so I'm going to leave it be. The ratio of bananas to sugar, I have 3 bananas and 1 sugar, and so I have a ratio of 3 to 1. I cannot simplify that any further, and so I'm going to leave it like that. The ratio of eggs to flour, I have 2 eggs and 2 cups of flour, so I could write a ratio of 2 to 2, but I also know they can both divide by 2 to make a simpler ratio of 1 to 1. The ratio of sugar to butter is 1 to half, or 1 to 0.5, but ratios do not tend to be anything other than a whole number, and so I'm going to multiply that 0.5 by 2 to get a whole number of 1, do the same to the other side, so I'll have a ratio of 2 to 1. This information is useful when trying to calculate empirical formula. So the definition of empirical formula is a chemical formula showing the simplest ratio of elements in a compound rather than the total number of atoms in a molecule. Sounds confusing, but at a very basic level, we're not looking at the actual formula, we're looking at the actual formula in its simplest ratio. So let's look at the example. How do we get there? So you can see here the chemical formula of water, H2O. I would find the ratio 2 to 1, that's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. I would try to simplify it, which I cannot do in this example, and so my empirical formula is simply the simplest ratio. In this example, still the same, H2O. Let's look at this next example. Here I have the chemical formula for ethane, C2H6. My ratio is 2 carbons to 6 hydrogens. Can I simplify it? Well, both those numbers will both divide by 2. So yes, I can simplify that to 1 to 3. So my simplified ratio is 1 to 3, and my empirical formula will simply be C1H3. Or I can present that as CH3, as we don't tend to write 1. Here's a slightly more complex molecule. This is glucose. The chemical formula for glucose, the actual number of atoms I would need, C6H12O6. So my ratio is 6 to 12 to 6. Now 6 goes very easily into 12, so I can find a simplified ratio there of 1 to 2 to 1. So my empirical formula is not C6H12O6, but is C1H2O1. Or if I take away the ones because we don't tend to write them, CH2O. So the empirical formula is simply the simplified ratio of the atoms. Okay, so now it's your turn to have a go. This part is really important, developing your understanding, because if you get the answer wrong, you need to know you're wrong and you need to know why you're wrong. So pause the video, have a go at finding the empirical formula. Is it already there or does it need simplifying? And then look at the answers. Pause the video now, please. Okay, so MgO, 1 to 1 ratio. I cannot simplify that any further, and so my empirical formula is still MgO. Si2O2, I have a ratio of 2 to 2. I could simplify that to 1 to 1, and therefore my empirical formula is simply Si1O1. My calcium chloride, I have a 2 to 4 ratio, which I could simplify to 1 to 2. So I would have CaCl2. For aluminium fluoride there, I've got Al6F18. They will both simplify. 6 goes into 18 3 times, and so I have a ratio of 1 to 3, and therefore it will be AlF3. And finally, if you hadn't realised, we've just done this one already, glucose, I can simplify that to 1 to 2 to 1, CH2O. Okay, again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video in a minute. This is looking at things in a slightly different way. It's understanding from the written word the ratios themselves and then seeing if you can simplify them any further. Pause the video now, please, and have a go. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk you through my thought process, how I'm going to work out these calculations in the hope that it will help you also understand. So the first one, the compound has 50% calcium and 50% oxygen. So that's a 50-50 ratio, which I can then simplify down to 1 to 1. And so my calcium and oxygen is simply going to be 1 to 1 CaO. For number 2, the compound has a 40 to 60% ratio, so 40 aluminium to 60% oxygen, so 40 to 60. I could simplify that to 4 to 6, and I could simplify that down to 2 to 3, I think. Yes, and so I have the formula Al2O3. Had to think there. So number 3, this compound has 20 grams of beryllium, can't speak properly, beryllium, and 40 grams of chlorine. So that's a 20 to a 40 ratio, which I could simplify to 2 to 4. I could simplify that to a 1 to 2 again. And so 1 to 2 would look like BeCl2. So it might be that you've simplified it, but have you got to its simplest form? So number 4, this compound has 5 grams of calcium, 10 grams of carbon and 5 grams of oxygen. So my ratios here are 5 to 10 to 5, which could easily be simplified as 1 to 2 to 1. So I'm going to have 1 calcium, 2 carbon and 1 oxygen. So I'm going to write it CaC2O. So just talking through my thought process there, I was thinking about, am I simplifying to its simplest form? So I simplified maybe once, but could I do it again? Some of you might have jumped that step and gone straight to simplest form. That's absolutely fine. And the other thing I was thinking about as I was writing it down and I was talking through was, am I getting them in the correct order? Because ratios, if it says calcium to oxygen, you've got to put them as calcium and oxygen. You can't swap it around oxygen to calcium. So let's now take that information and transfer it to an exam style question. Pause the video and have a go yourself. Okay, well first of all I'm going to look at my actual numbers. So I've got 2 carbons, 2 oxygens and 4 hydrogens. So that's 2 to 2 to 4, which I can reduce down to 1 to 1 to 2. So I'm going to have 1 carbon to 1 oxygen to 2 hydrogen. Here's the information. Now you'll notice it's written out slightly differently, but it didn't give us the correct order at the time, and so I'm okay with putting it in a slightly different order, but I do have a 1 carbon, 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen ratio. Okay, pause the video and have a go at this final question for me, please. Okay, so the molecular formula of benzene is C6H6, so 6 to 6 ratio, which can be simplified down to 1 to 1 ratio, and therefore the answer would be CH. Okay, that's the end of this lesson, guys. I hope it's been helpful. Off you go and do the quiz and do your best. Bye.